Chapter 8 Flight of the Fat Lady. In no time at all, Defense Against Dark Arts had become most people's favorite class. Only Draco Malfoy and his gang of Slytherins had anything bad to say about Professor Lupin. "Look at the state of his robes," Malfoy would say in a loud whisper as Professor Lupin passed. "He dresses like an old house elf." But no one else cared that Professor Lupin's robes were patched and frayed. His next few lessons were just as interesting as his first. After the Bogarts, they studied red caps, nasty little goblin-like creatures that lurked wherever there had been bloodshed. The dungeon of castles and the potholes of deserted battlefields waiting with bludgeon those who had gotten lost. From red caps, they moved on to kappas, creepy water dwellers. They looked like scaly monkeys with webbed hands, itching to strangle unwitting waders in their ponds. Harry only wished he was as happy with some of his other classes. Worst of all was potions. Snape was particularly vindictive mood these days, and no one had any was in any doubt why. The story of the Bogart assuming Snape's shape and the way that Neville had dressed it up in his grandmother's clothes had traveled through the school like wildfire. Snape didn't seem to find it funny. His eyes the very mention of Professor Lupin's name, and he was bullying Neville worse than ever. Harry was also growing to dread the hours he spent in Professor Trelawney's stifling tower room, deciphering lopsided shapes and symbols, trying to ignore the way Professor Trelawney's enormous eyes filled with tears every time she looked at him. He couldn't like Professor Trelawney, even though she treated with respect bordering on reverence by many of the class. Parvati Patil and Lavender Brown had taken a haunting Professor Trelawney's tower room at lunchtimes, and always returning with annoying superior looks on their faces as though they knew things about that others didn't. They also started using hushed voices whenever they spoke to Harry, as though he was on his deathbed. Nobody really liked Care of Magical Creatures after the action-packed first class had become extremely dull. Hagrid seemed to have lost his confidence, and there was now spending lessons after lessons learning how to look after flubberworms, which had to be some of the most boring creatures in existence. "Why would anyone bother looking after them?" said Ron, after yet another hour poking shredded lettuce down a flubberworm's tiny throats. As a start of October, however, Harry had something else to occupy him, something enjoyable. It more than made up for his unsatisfactory classes. The Quidditch season was approaching, and Oliver Wood, captain of Gryffindor, called a meeting that one Thursday evening to discuss the tactics of the new season. There were 7 people on a Quidditch team, 3 chasers, whose job was to score goals by putting a quaffle, a red soccer-sized ball, through the 50-foot-high hoops at each end of the field. 2 beaters, who were equipped with heavy bats to repel the bludgers, 2 heavy black balls that zoomed around trying to attack the players, a keeper who defended the goalposts, and the seeker, who had the hardest job of all, catching the golden snitch, a tiny winged little walnut-sized ball, whose capture ended the game and earned the seeker's team an extra 150 points. Oliver Wood was a burly 17-year-old, now in his 7th year, final year at Hogwarts. There was a quiet sort of desperation in his voice as he addressed the 6 fellow team members in the chilly locker room on the edge of the darkening Quidditch field. "This is our last chance, my last chance to win the Quidditch Cup," he told them, striding up and down in front of them. "I'll be leaving at the end of this year. I'll never get another shot at it. Gryffindor hasn't won for 7 years now. Okay, we've had the worst luck in the world, injuries, and then the tournament getting called off last year." Wood swallowed as though the memory of it still brought a lump to his throat. "But we also know we've got the best ruddy team in the whole school." he said, punching his fist into his other hand, the old manic glint back in his eye. We've got three superb chasers. Wood pointed to Alicia Spinner, Angelina Johnson, and Katie Bell. We've got two unbeatable beaters. Stop it, Oliver. You're embarrassing us, said Fred and George Weasley together, pretending to blush. And we've got a seeker who has never failed to win us a match. Wood rumbled, glaring at Harry with a kind of furious pride. And me, he added as afterthought. We think we're pretty good. We think you're pretty good too, all of us, said George. Spanking good keeper, said Fred. The point is, Wood went on, resuming his pacing, the Quidditch Cup should have had our name on it in the last 2 years, ever since Harry's joined the team. I've thought the thing was in the bag, but we haven't gotten it. And this year, the last chance we'll get to finally see it with our name on the thing. Wood spoke so objectively that Fred and George looked sympathetic. Oliver, this year's our year, said Fred. We'll do it, Oliver, said Angelina. Definitely, said Harry. Full of determination, the team training sessions, 3 evenings a week. The weather was getting colder and wetter, and the nights were darker, but no amount of mud, wind, or rain would tarnish Harry's wonderful vision of finally winning a silver Quidditch Cup. Harry returned to Gryffindor common room one evening after training, cold, stiff, but pleased with the way their practice had gone, to find the room buzzing excitedly. What happened? He asked Ron and Hermione, who were sitting at the best chairs in the fireside, completing some star charts for astronomy. First Hogmeads weekend, said Ron, pointing at a notice that appeared at the battered old bulletin board. End of October, Halloween. Excellent, said Fred, who had followed Harry through the porthole. I need to visit Zonko's. I'm nearly out of stink pellets. Harry threw himself into the chair beside Ron, his high spirits ebbing away. Hermione seemed to read his mind. Harry, I'm sure you'll be able to go next time, she said. They're bound to catch Black soon. He's been sighted once already. Black's not fool enough to try anything at Hogsmeade, said Ron. Ask McGonagall if you can go this time, Harry. The next time one might not be for ages. Ron, said Hermione. Harry's supposed to stay in school. Well, he can't be the only third year left behind, said Ron. Ask McGonagall to go on. Go on, Harry. Yeah, I think I will, said Harry, making up his mind. Hermione opened her mouth to argue, but at this moment Crookshanks leapt lightly onto her lap. Large, dead spider was dangling from his mouth. Does he have to eat that in front of us? Ron said, scowling. Clever Crookshanks! Did you catch that all by yourself? Said Hermione. Crookshanks slowly chewed up the spider, his yellow eyes fixed insolently on Ron. Just keep him over there, that's all, Ron said irritably, turning back to his star chart. I've got Scabbers sleeping in my bag. Harry yawned. He really wanted to go to bed, but still had his own shout to complete. So he pulled his bag toward him, took out the parchment, put ink and quill, and started to work. You can copy mine if you like, Ron said, labeling the first star with a flourish, shoving the charts toward Harry. Hermione disapproved of copy and pursed her lips, but didn't say anything. Crookshanks was still staring unblinkingly at Ron, flicking the end of her bushy tail, then without warning, pounced. Oi! Ron roared, seizing his bag as Crookshanks sank 4 sets of claws deeply into it and began tearing ferociously. Get off, you stupid animal! Ron tried to pull the bag away from Crookshanks, but Crookshanks clung on to it, spitting and slashing. Ron, don't hurt him! Squealed Hermione. The whole common room was watching Ron as she whirled the bag around, Crookshanks still clinging to it, and Scabbers came flying out of the top. Catch that cat! Ron yelled. Crookshanks freed himself from the remnants of the bag, sprang over to the table, and chased after terrified Scabbers. George Weasley made a lunge for Crookshanks, but missed. Scabbers streaked his way through 20 pairs of legs and shot beneath the old chest of drawers. Crookshanks skidded to a halt and crouched down low with his bandy legs and started making furious swipes beneath it with his front paw. Ron and Hermione hurried over. Hermione grabbed Crookshanks around the middle and heaved him away. Ron threw himself on his stomach and with a great difficulty pulled Scabbers out by the tail. Look at him, he said furiously, Hermione dangling Scabbers in front of her. He's skin and bones! You keep that cat away from him! Crookshanks doesn't understand it's wrong, said Hermione, her voice shaking. All cats chase rats, Ron. There's something funny about that animal, said Ron, who was trying to persuade, frantically wiggling Scabbers back into his pocket. It heard me say that Scabbers was in my bag. Oh, what rubbish! Said Hermione impatiently. Crookshanks could smell him, Ron. How else do you think that cat's got it in for Scabbers? Said Ron, ignoring the people around him, who were starting to giggle. And Scabbers was here first, and he's ill. Ron marched through the common room, out of sight, up to the stairs to the boys' dormitory. Ron was still in a bad room with Hermione the next day. He barely talked to her all through herbology, even though he and Harry and Hermione were working together on the same puffapod. How's Scabbers? Hermione asked timidly and stripped the fat pink pods from the plants and emptied them shining beans into the wooden pail. He's hiding at the bottom of my bed, shaking, said Ron angrily, missing the pail and scattering beans all over the greenhouse floor. Careful, Weasley, careful! Cried Professor Sprout as the beans burst into bloom before their very eyes. They had Transfiguration next. Harry, who had resolved to ask Professor McGonagall after the lessons whether he could go into Hogsmeade with the rest, joined the line outside the class, trying to decide how he was going to argue his case. He was distracted as ever by a disturbance in front of the line. Lavender Brown seemed to be crying. Parvati had her arm around her and explaining something to Seamus Finnegan and Dean Thomas, who were looking very serious. What's the matter, Lavender? Said Hermione anxiously as she and Ron went to join the groups. She got a letter from home this morning, Parvati whispered. It's her rabbit, Binky. He's been killed by a fox. Oh, said Hermione. I'm sorry, Lavender. I should have known, said Lavender tragically. You know what day it is. The 16th of October? That thing you're dreading. It will happen on the 16th of October. Remember, she was right. She was right. The whole class gathered around Lavender now. Seamus shook his head seriously. Hermione hesitated. Then she said, You were dreading Binky being killed by a fox? Well, not necessarily a fox, said Lavender, looking up at Hermione with streaming eyes. But I was obviously dreading dying, wasn't I? Him dying, wasn't I? Oh, said Hermione. She paused again. Then, was Binky an old rabbit? No, sobbed Lavender. He was only a baby. Parvati tightened her arm around Lavender's shoulders. But then, why would you dread him dying? Said Hermione. Parvati glared at her. Well, look at it logically, said Hermione, turning the rest of the group. I mean, Binky didn't even die today, did he? Lavender just got the news today. Lavender wailed loudly. And he can't have been dreading it because it's come on as a real shock. Don't mind Hermione, Lavender, Ron said loudly. She doesn't think of other people's pets matter very much. Professor McGonagall opened the classroom door, and in a moment, which was perhaps lucky, Hermione and Ron were looking at daggers at each other. Got into the class, and they seated themselves on the other side of each side of other side of Harry. Didn't talk to each other the whole class. Harry still hadn't decided how or what he was going to say to Professor McGonagall when the bell rang at the end of the lesson, but she was who brought up the subject of Hogmeads first. One moment, please, she called to the class. Made the class leave. As you all in my house should know, Hogsmeade permission forms to me before Halloween. No farm, no visiting the village. So don't forget. Neville put up his hand. Please, Professor, I think I've lost. Your grandmother sent yours to me directly, Longbottom. Professor McGonagall, she seemed to think it was safer. Well, that's all. That's all. You may all leave. Ask her now, Ron hissed at Harry. Oh, but Hermione again. Go for it, Harry, said Ron stubbornly. Harry waited for the rest of the class to disappear and then heard her nervously from Professor McGonagall's desk. Yes, Potter? Harry took a deep breath. Professor, my aunt and uncle, they forgot to sign my form. Professor McGonagall looked at her square glasses at him. So, do you think it'd be all right? I mean, will it be okay if I go to Hogsmeade? Professor McGonagall looked down and began shuffling papers on the desk. I'm afraid not, Potter, she said. You heard what I said. No form, no visiting the village. That's the rule. But, Professor, my aunt and uncle, you know, they're muggles. They don't really understand about Hogwarts forms and stuff, Harry said while Ron egged him on with vigorous nods. If you said I could go, but I don't say, said Professor McGonagall, standing up, piling her papers into a really neat drawer. The form clearly states that the parent or guardian must give permission. She turned to give him a look with an odd expression on her face. Was it pity? I'm sorry, Potter, but that's my final word. You had better hurry, or you'll be late for your next lesson. There was nothing to be done. Ron called after Professor McGonagall a lot of names that greatly annoyed Hermione. Hermione assumed an "oh for the best" expression that made Ron angrier. And Harry had to endure everyone in the class talking loudly and happily about they were going to do first once they got into Hogsmeade.